Our next guard retention movement is going to be the Half Granby. That's what we call it. Inversion or partial inversion, Gangora. Anyway, there's a Portuguese Brazilian term for this that I had never heard before, but it's become quite popular as well. So, you know, whatever you know this by, the movement is turning away to invert your hips to square them back up. Where this will come into play, if we use that kind of drag kind of scenario here, is if I'm unable to hit this high leg, either for flexibility or angle reasons, then inverting my hips like this creates, for one, a barrier on the low side. So like Rory was trying to pass like to my left. I need to maintain the knee-elbow connection. So as I invert my hips, I'm maintaining the knee-elbow connection here. For instance, if my leg were a little bit away, Rory's arm could come through, and now the fact that I'm inverted, my spine is a frame, but eventually he will get past that and drag me down. But if I manage to stick my butt up in the air, have my right knee-elbow connection, my left knee-elbow connection, which is really more knee-shoulder connection at this point, I now turned into kind of like, well, a ball. My spine is slightly curved, my legs are slightly bent, and if Rory wants to pressure into me now, he's not going to pass my guard. I should now be able to, just by maintaining my right leg hooking on his hip in this case, return myself to my guard just by doing a hamstring curl, and that action centers me back up. So if I'm turned away from him quite a bit, as long as something is in his way, preventing him from actually occupying the space between my hip and my armpit, as I now activate my right leg and I curl my heel, that brings me back to my guard. The only thing that's required for this is the ability to bring your knees like fairly close to your chest. Again, if you're not particularly flexible, this is like, we're gonna show one more guard retention movement after this video it's great in certain circumstances, others it's not optimal, but it may be the one you have to do instead of this if you simply cannot comfortably. So like, you don't have to be able to do this. This is not a requirement. It helps, but you have to be able to do this. You have to be able to put your knees sort of to your chest. So if Rory pushes my legs out of the way, and I think he's gonna maybe occupy this space, if I can comfortably bring my knees to my chest and be in this position without any jeopardy to like my neck or my ribs or anything like that, I'm fine. If this is like causing me inordinate strain, I don't want to be here. It's really important. And one thing that we should mention is I do not want to be here. Yeah. And so the level of flexibility required to safely perform this is one where you can just kind of sit like that on your shoulders.
So this hip angle that Rob's creating by lifting his hips on the mat and turning himself into that partial inversion is huge to be able to redirect my arms, and so that he's able to deny me meaningful lever control. If I was to access this left leg as a lever by creating a frame out like this, and I have like a graphics hopefully here that makes a lot of sense. If Rob was to try and just turn his hips back into me, you can see how I just have this lever access and he can turn as hard as he wants. One, if it's out like this away from him, he'll just never turn into me.
Yeah.
And then the only
way I can is by, so right now I have knee elbow connection.
Yeah.
If I want to turn back in, I've got to open that knee elbow connection up, which is exactly what he wants.
So rather than driving right into the frame is how I've designed it, because I've optimized the force that I'm ready to take on anything directly opposing as a force vector. Rob's going to change the angle now by lifting his hips and now swinging his leg in an arcing direction, so you can see how my arm now gets access as a lever. So it's just a frame versus lever battle. I access his leg as a lever, and instead of taking it on as a frame, he changes the angle.
I change the angle. We'll give another angle in a second what I'm doing with my foot. I change the angle by using my foot and my arm to push off the ground to create base. That extends Rory's leg. I'm hooking his body with my right leg. Extends Rory's arm, sorry. And that allows me to deflect. So what I'm doing here when Rory pins my leg is I'm just touching the floor while maintaining my knee elbow connection. Again, the thing that people struggle with these movements is they tend to, like, it's not wrong to touch the ground. It's wrong to touch the ground like this and create an open space. So as long as I touch my foot to the mat here, and now I'm pushing off with the ball of my foot, You may notice that my ability to rotate my foot into position, even if I'm like basically almost flat on my back, I can put my toes on the mat. Again, not everyone can do this. So I'm not trying to get you to rotate your tibia outwardly. I'm just trying to get you to turn enough that your foot should naturally touch the ground. And then by pushing off the floor, keeping sometimes your head, usually preferably your shoulder, as your base, while you then activate your elbow, creating a lateral delt raise, you will be able to push your butt up in the air. And again, not so much that I end up like this. If I'm crunched up on my head, I solve no problems. I potentially just risk a neck injury while Rory still succeeds with his pass. That would suck. So I'm rolling just enough that my hip is in the air, that I can now propel myself forward, hooking his body and swinging myself around. It looks like you have to be very flexible for this. There is a minimum flexibility requirement, but as long as you can just sort of do this, you should be okay.
Just an important thing I want to note here, because some people just gravitate to this immediately because they love it, especially people with flexibility. Yeah. This should not be your first line of defense with guard retention, because your hips are turning away from your opponent. So when we talked about the high leg, that is absolutely what I want. So this, when I'm here doing guard retention against Rob, plan A is to always keep my hips facing and constantly just be doing like my 8-meter paddles and just be bringing my legs in and performing high legs, whether it's just very small pummeling movements to the high leg or actually getting dragged and performing complete high legs. I'm never going to look to do that half Granby. It's only if I screw up significantly that then I'm like, oh crap, I have to actually start to perform a movement in which my hips have been turned away. Rob's got a dominant angle because just like as we know in fighting and boxing, anything, I'm here facing Rob. If Rob manages to get an angle like this to me, it's a dominant angle for him. I'm going to end up getting lit up here. It's the same in guard retention. I do not turn myself like that purposely just because I can abuse something like, say, flexibility, and because it's a really hard movement to shut down, especially at the earlier stages. You're going to find against white belts and blue belts especially, they have no answers for a good half Granby.
Yeah, we've got people who come in here who've got like whether it's a break dancing or gymnastics, or just naturally flexible, like people who just can, without warming up, they can just stick their legs behind their head, and they have very difficult guards to pass for beginners, because beginners have no way of getting through this space, because they're only trying to get through this space. When you bring your legs up like this, you solve one problem, but you create another one, which is, you don't have frames in the way, and somebody who's more skillful will be able to work their way through that guard. It's just a problem you may not run into until you're regularly rolling with higher belts, more skillful practitioners, I should say. So just be aware of it. This is definitely something you can abuse, very much like the 240-pound former football player can abuse bench pressing people off of them in the beginning of jiu-jitsu. Bendy little guys can abuse this and can abuse this inversion to avoid having to develop the other skills within guard retention. So it's something that we want to avoid. One other thing to kind of note here, so if Rory pushes me over and I'm creating this invert, like we talked about the positioning of my spine can become a frame. I don't have any frames with my legs. What I want to try to do as much as possible is still maintain an arm frame when I'm doing this. If you're very flexible, if you're quite good at this, if you're quite quick, this is something that you probably won't require. Like if you back up a little bit and go to a standing position. Yep. If Rory throws my legs by quickly here and I just do that, I'm gonna be fine. Yep. No real problems. But if Rory, let's say, comes down to his knees and gets a little bit closer and pushes my legs down, and I just kind of, oh damn. It's too late now, because rather than just having a frame against my leg and activating it as a lever, Rory also got his weight onto my hips. And so at this point, there's no way for me to Granby to turn away to invert. So it's important to note that although sometimes this frame will not be required, the concept of having redundancy to your frames is an important one. And the closer somebody is to your hips, particularly if they're passing from the knees, you are going to want to recognize the leading edge, use that. So if Rory's trying to get his chest to my hip now, that bought me the time that I needed and the space that I needed to actually execute the half Granby. So again, not always, But during the development phase, it's better, even if you're quite bendy, even if you're successful with this, it's better if you have the habit of having this frame.
Yeah, some highlighters, like Rob was saying, can be very just fast and streamlined, and sometimes it's going to be a
Granby's.
war. Granby's, where it's going to be a bit of a war here, and someone's going to be much more tightly connected to your hips, and you're going to have to slowly build up into this position, and it's going to be almost like 5 to 7 small little movements and adjustments to be able to perform that half Granby. And then if I'm standing, it's going to be changing as the leading edge. So when we're talking about like the shin now, as I'm bringing my leg in
So
here,
that may be what I'm framing off of.
now by me being standing, there's naturally a lot more space to work from.
Yeah.
But even when I really quickly streamline and do this movement, I find most of the time I still end up kind of extending my arm out like this because it's just ready to catch something.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily going to be connected every time, but there's no harm in me as long as I'm keeping my elbow in close to my body and I'm not opening myself up to arm bars or somebody controlling the inside space. Every time I perform that half Granby, this arm is here ready to catch something so that if Rob does make contact with me at some point, one, I have the sensitivity to be able to feel that and react to it, but I also just have that barrier there at all times to check the space.
Yeah, and that note that Rory made about the arm being extended out, you can end up on someone's highlight reel getting jumping arm barred if you're not really wary of that. So just so people can have an idea of what we're talking about, if I redirect Rory and he's, let's say, doing that, I can absolutely move into an arm bar. So the positioning of the arm relatively close to the hip, not when we talked about the leading edge and we talked about how you need to recognize where it is, and that can take some time. This is one of those lessons you're gonna end up learning probably the hard way. This is the leading edge. This is not the leading edge right now. If I'm in a standing position, this is definitely a point of vulnerability. Don't do this, do this. Whereas again, once I'm on my knees here, now this is the leading edge, because now for me to try to hit that arm bar on Rory, if we were to have a race, and so I'm gonna go 3, 2, 1, go. 3, 2, 1, go. Oh. He's gonna win the race and I'm gonna look like I slipped on a banana peel. Don't worry about it in those situations, but just know that, over the course of your initial development, you'll screw that up sometimes. You'll go to the shoulder instead of the hip, and the problem won't be that you get armbarred. The problem will be that you don't get armbarred. The problem will be if your training partners don't have that ability, because that jumping armbar from there is not something everyone you roll with will be able to do.
Yeah.
So just understand that that's where the nexus between your mistakes and your training partner's ability may not be at a point where you're going to receive the feedback that you need to receive, that that's not the leading edge. So that's why we included this note.